This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Across the country, school districts are grappling with staffing shortages that are making it tough to recover from the disruptions of the COVID-19 pandemic. Matt Barnum, Chalkbeat's national reporter, took a look at the current landscape for teacher shortages and is here to share what he learned and debunk some of the conventional wisdom around these numbers and what might be behind them. Matt, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Good to be here again, Emily.
Let's start right at the top. So Chalkbeat surveyed some of the nation's biggest school districts. You heard back from about 20 of them. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. We tried to get the 30 largest, and as some of our listeners may know, it's not always easy to pry data from school districts, but we got 20 large districts, and most of those 20 came from among the 30 largest in the country.
So let's talk about teacher shortages specifically, because we're going to talk about staffing shortages more broadly. What did they say about teachers?
Yeah, so the top line takeaway is that teacher shortages are worse, and more particularly, schools are starting the year with more empty teaching positions, meaning they advertised a position or there was a position that they wanted to fill, but they couldn't fill it by the start of the school year, which is a real problem. You know, for anyone who's worked in schools or been to school themselves, they know that having a regular full-time teacher on day one is really important. And it's not the same if a teacher comes in 2 weeks later, and research bears that out, that it has an effect on student learning. So 18 of the 20 largest districts started with more teacher vacancies this year than last year. And the vast majority of them started with more teacher openings than 2 years ago. And so it sort of looked like the trend was sort of like a check mark, where there was a dip in teacher vacancies from 2019 to 2020, but then a sharp increase in 2021. So more teacher vacancies in 2021 than in 2019 or 2020. Now, I do want to be clear, the vast majority of teaching positions are filled. We're still talking about, a teacher vacancy rate of like 2 to 4%, but it is higher than it has been in years past in most of the large districts that we looked at.
And historically, those vacancies tend to impact the schools that need a stable teacher workforce the most, and those are schools with higher proportions of lower income students. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have the best data on this, but I think the data we have and basic theory and everything we know about how schools operate and run would suggest that that's the case, that low income and students of color are most likely to bear the brunt of these teacher vacancies.
So what else do we know about these vacancies? Do we have any sense whether these are new positions that have been added, for example, using some of the federal recovery money that's been made available, or are they positions that existed in the prior school year and people have left?
Yeah, so this was something that I worked really hard to get to the bottom of, and I just don't have a great answer right now. Most people I talked to suggested that it was some combination of both, but that it varies from district to district. But again, I just don't have firm data to answer that question. There were some places that said definitively, yes, a large portion, this is Miami-Dade, they said that a large portion of the new vacancies were additional positions created to support students. But some districts did see increases in turnover, and some principals I talked to and HR directors I talked to said, look, we just were not getting as many applicants through the door for our positions as we normally would. So I do suspect that this is both a supply and a demand issue. But again, I'm waiting and looking for better data on this to confirm.
Matt, I'm trying to decide whether I need to start adding sound effects to EWA Radio, because what I would love to do with what you just said is ring a bell. And the bell I want to ring is that reporters should feel comfortable telling their readers what they don't know. It helps to inform the conversation. It helps to inform their understanding. And it prevents some of the misconceptions that tend to bloom around these kinds of stories.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think we should always be transparent with readers about what is known and what is not known, and then do the work of following up to try to figure out the answers to what we don't know.
So let's talk about what we do or we don't know. There's a presumption, I think, that teachers are leaving because of the pandemic for reasons perhaps dissatisfaction with the job or the needs of their own families. Is it possible to even make some of that claim?
Right. So I would say the short answer is we don't know yet. And so just to back up a year, I think a lot of our listeners know that there were a lot of concerns going into the 2020 school year that we would see exodus of teachers. Recall that was after the 2019-2020 school year was really disrupted with the pandemic, and going into 2020-2021 year, there were a lot of concerns legitimate concerns from teachers about what the school year would look like. But we simply did not see an increase in teacher turnover going into that year. In fact, we actually saw a decrease in teacher turnover almost everywhere that I could find data. And I think a lot of that had to do with the economy. There just weren't a lot of good jobs on offer at that moment. So many people weren't going to leave a stable teaching job. So then going into this school year, the 21-22 school year, a lot of people were again expecting an uptick in teacher turnover. The economy is better. So if people want jobs outside of teaching, they have a better shot at getting it. And there is evidence that teachers were really stressed out last year, more so than even other professions. So my hypothesis, and the hypothesis of a lot of experts that I talked to, is that we're going to see an increase in teacher turnover going into this school year. But the data isn't out yet. I don't know the answer to that, and I'm slowly trying to collect as much data as I can, but too soon to say.
And there are a lot of other factors that could be playing into this, right? I mean, first of all, we've got a job market that's just wacky all over. I mean, I know personally a few people who have chosen to take a new path and either leave a private sector job and go back to public school teaching, or the flip side, some teachers who have decided to take, an industry job. But you wrote a few years ago that the research was showing a connection between, for example, when there are fewer job protections provided by a strong union, that poor schools were losing some of their teachers. We know from some of the national surveys that parents have said that they would discourage their child from seeking a career in education. I mean, all of those things were already in play before the pandemic even hit.
Right. I mean, I think that what that highlights is that there are so many variables going on here. And it's the economy, it's COVID, it's school working conditions, it's pay, it's the extra stimulus money, it's job protections. And then at that point, when you have so many variables, you really just have to look at the underlying data, which right now we don't have. And we can all make hypotheses, until the cows come home, if that's the expression. But we really just have to wait for the data to make firm conclusions.
So where do I go to look for that data if I'm an education journalist? Is someone tracking teacher shortages in some kind of official capacity? Are there any reliable national numbers or percentages we should be watching?
Well, the short answer is no. There isn't some national database, and that is what we get from having a really fragmented, state and locally driven education system. So when I did my story last year about teacher turnover, I tried to collect as much state and large city level data as I could. And so I think I got 5 or 6 states and several large cities. And I was comfortable making a pretty strong conclusion because all the data I was getting across very different large states was pointing in the same direction, that teacher turnover had not increased. And in fact, it had probably decreased. So there's nothing really good, I don't think, at the national level. And I would look at the state and local levels.
When I was a beat reporter in Las Vegas, we always started the school year short teachers. And I mean, there were years when they would hire anywhere from 700 to, 1,500 new teachers for the number of new schools that were opening, and they may be short 200 or 300 positions. What did you see some of the patterns when you were looking across these states? Were there places that had always historically been shorter and they're just deeper in the hole right now? Or did you find some unexpected staffing gaps?
Well, it's hard to answer that question because I was only looking at large districts, and most of those districts were urban districts, and then they also varied a lot in size. And so there were some places like Los Angeles that in typical years started with very, very few teacher vacancies. In 2021, they started with fewer than 100 teacher vacancies for a very large workforce. And that's, I think it was like a 0.2% unfilled teacher rate. But then this year, that number jumped to 500 or so. And so that went up from 0.2% to, I think 2%. And so it was a really, really significant increase from a baseline of very few teacher vacancies. But then there were others who didn't see such a big increase. I think Clark County may have been one of them, but still had in terms of overall numbers, still had a pretty high number.
So, Chad Alderman, he's a researcher at the Edunomics Lab at Georgetown University, previously with Bellwether Education. He said that based on his research, job openings in public education are running about twice as high as usual for this time of year. And I'm wondering, in your reporting, what did you see in terms of staffing issues more broadly in some of the other key areas like school nurses, counselors, bus drivers, other support staff?
Right. Well, you would sort of have to be living under a rock if you hadn't heard about the bus driver shortage that is rippling across school districts, across the whole country. The data that Chad is relying on is coming from the Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics. And I think it really tracks with what we're seeing anecdotally, that there are just a lot more open positions. And I mean, it really does seem to run the gamut. Colleagues of mine have reported on a large increase in open school nurses and in school security staff and in cafeteria workers. And I talked to a school district official who they were excited to use the new federal money to hire their first full-time counselor. And I believe this was in rural Idaho, but then they couldn't find one. So they weren't able to do that. But it does seem like, and I don't think we have the perfect data on this, but it does seem like that the biggest shortages are in lower wage positions, not the relatively higher wage positions. So more bus driver shortages and paraprofessional shortages and cafeteria shortages than teacher or counselor shortages. Though, as my reporting bears out, we're also seeing this in teachers. I just think it's worse in these lower wage positions, especially bus drivers.
We're talking with Matt Barnum, national reporter for Chalkbeat, about the nation's teacher shortage. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And many thanks to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and your feedback are helping us to grow. Matt, I'm wondering, is there a story to be done for reporters on how the pandemic is impacting things like teacher colleges, either in how they're recruiting the new students or how they're training the ones they already have, and how that might relate to this shortage story?
Oh, yeah, I think there is, though I think it's another example where we really have to be careful with the data, because I think a very pat story that has been told but has not been proven is that fewer people are going into teaching or interested in training to become teachers because of the pandemic and because even of criticism of teachers and their unions in their last year. I don't think there is any evidence of that, either strongly for or against that. And so I think that would be a real question that I would like to explore from a data-driven perspective. I'd also be really curious about schools of education and other programs to train teachers about how they're placing teachers and how things are different in terms of folks trying to hire teachers. How is the job market different? Are all their teaching candidates just being snapped up? Is there a lot of competition? Have things flipped where teaching candidates have all the power now and can be really choosy about where they work?
I would love to see a story on the attrition rate for folks who finished up their training at the School of Education and were in their student teaching program, but had to do it remotely via Zoom, and who either just didn't like it or became discouraged or maybe didn't get the training that they needed to get the right kind of start in the classroom and gave it up.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, though. I've also heard it in the other direction that there were some benefits for first year teachers and maybe even student teachers of starting with Zoom because they could sort of dip their toes into the water of being a teacher. But I do really wonder what the adjustment is like. If you were a first year teacher and you taught predominantly virtually, what's it like? You're probably now a second year teacher, but actually feeling more like a first year teacher this year.
Do you have any sense that the pandemic is going to change how schools are staffed, that this is going to be some kind of a long-term new way of operating? Or are we just kind of in crisis mode here and then we're going to go back to business as usual?
I think that historically, the safe prediction is always to go back to business as usual, in that there are a lot of structures in place in schools, some of them good, some of them not so good, that have a lot of staying power. And sometimes it's for good reason, but that just predictions that things are going to be dramatically different typically do not bear out. Doesn't mean it can't happen. I think what I'm most curious about, and perhaps the biggest potential for some reshuffling, is with money. We have all this federal money, and some of it is being used to hire folks, but all that money is temporary. I think a question is, could there be more sustained investments from the state and even from the federal government that could allow some rethinking or just more people who are working in schools?
That's a great question because we want to know, are they actually changing the salary schedule for everybody, or are they doing it as a one-time sort of inducement to get people to come in? Do you know anything else about some of the carrots that districts are using to try to lure folks in?
Well, I think there's a lot. Again, this is super anecdotal, but my impression is that there are more sort of one time efforts at luring people in, signing bonuses, 1 year bonuses. And that's because schools are flush with cash right now. But as mentioned, that cash is temporary. So school officials are really wary of saying, we're going to change our whole salary schedule because they don't think it's sustainable.
Super Anecdotal is a really good band name.
If I were starting a band, I would definitely take that.
I think I could see you playing bass in Super Anecdotal, Matt. As we look at this, is this a short-term crisis that once these positions are filled, it's solved?
The answer is probably not. I mean, first of all, even if you fill a teaching position a few weeks into the year, that can still have long run effects, some negative effects on the kids in that classroom because they didn't have a teacher for 2 weeks, a full time teacher, a permanent teacher for 2 weeks. And that can shape the culture of a classroom for the whole year. And research has shown it has that negative effect. I think the other piece is that the vacancy rates are sort of the tip of the iceberg. Just because you got a warm body to fill a position or someone who's certified to fill a position doesn't mean you got really talented people for the position. So there's some evidence that when schools and districts are hiring rapidly, they sort of lower their standards a bit for who they're hiring. I don't want to make broad generalizations of folks who were hired this year. I'm sure that many are extremely talented, but when you're scrambling to fill a job, you just may not have the same high standards that you otherwise would have. And I heard this from HR directors and principals that I talked to.
Matt, what are some of the do's and don'ts in covering teacher shortages?
I think the most important thing is hone in on the actual data on what we know and just push anyone who tells you something about teacher turnover or teacher vacancies. Say, okay, what is the data for this claim? And a corollary of this, and why there are some instances where the data doesn't always match up with what we're hearing, is because people don't always do what they say. And what I mean by that is some teachers and school staff may have been really stressed out last year. And they may have thought, you know what, I'm out. There's no way I'm coming back next year. And then lo and behold, they do come back for all sorts of reasons. And so oftentimes we'll see people who say that they're going to leave who aren't going to leave. Now, I think an important caveat on that is that I think even if teachers or school staff are stressed out and they do come back, that's still a problem. That's still something that schools have to deal with and school officials have to be cognizant of. So we shouldn't just say, oh, well, they returned to the classroom, so everything is fine. Well, high rates of stress among teachers could absolutely trickle down to schools and to students in a way that we care about, but it may just not show up in turnover. So the biggest lesson is look at the data if you can get it.
Well, it's funny because that makes me think about a story out of my home state of Massachusetts where the state police said that they had talked to dozens of state troopers who said they weren't going to come back to the job, that they were quitting out of frustration or because they didn't want to get vaccinated or various things. But it turns out that only one person actually quit. But of course, that survey result in the top line is what gets into the headlines.
No, I think that's exactly right. I was thinking of the same analogy, and that's also applying to school districts now that are imposing these vaccine mandates, and they have a lot of people who are insisting that they will not get vaccinated. And to me, that's sort of like they're playing a very high stakes game of chicken, the school district and the staff member. But I do think we're seeing evidence that some vaccine holdouts have chosen to get vaccinated because of the mandate.
A big portion of our audience, of course, are other journalists who may be covering this issue. And I'd love to just get from you just a question that they should ask of some different people when they're calling them up to talk about this story. So what's a question for your district's HR department?
Well, the HR department are the best people to ask because they should have the data. So the question is, where's the data? Show me the data. On another matter, I think it's always worth asking them, well, if you have a shortage, what are you doing about it? And I know many HR departments are racing to try to do things, but actually honing in on what substantive changes that they're making rather than just, oh, well, we're advertising for this aggressively or we're trying to grow our pool. Understanding what, if anything, they're doing about it is really important.
I think that's great. And also, I would ask them to be hugely specific about what vacancy means. For example, are these new positions? Are they in elementary, secondary? Are they special education? Are you looking for Spanish teachers? What exactly is it that you need?
Yep, that's a great point.
What's the question you want to ask the teachers union?
Well, I think I would ask them if they're making a prediction about increases in teacher turnover or some coming bad scenario, whether their prior predictions had panned out. And so I might check whether they had claimed in the past that there would be a big increase in teacher turnover at a certain point, and then check whether that had actually happened if you're just relying on their predictions for a story.
If you're a reporter who gets an opportunity to talk to some teachers who decided to leave the job, what are the questions for them?
What would have kept you in the job? And what, if anything, could bring you back?
And what about a teacher who decided to stay?
Well, I would ask, how's this school year going for you? And how are the shortages affecting you in your classroom? I think people who work in schools have a very keen sense that classrooms and teachers are not an island unto themselves. And so when there's a teacher vacancy or a bus driver vacancy or a substitute vacancy, it has ripple effects across the whole school. And that often means a lot more work for teachers or work that they're doing to cover for their colleagues, which is taking away from other time that they could be spent improving their lessons. So just understanding the ripple effects of these vacancies from people who work in schools.
Matt, I have mixed feelings about Twitter generally, but one of the things I do enjoy on it is your threads where you just take apart a data point and show us either why it's not reliable or maybe it's even completely fabricated. I'm thinking about the way you've sort of railed for years, shouting into the wind against the trope that 65% of the jobs of the future haven't been invented yet. And I'm wondering, do you want to take this opportunity? Is there any other data point in education you'd like to quash?
Well, Emily, it's 65%, but some sources say it's 85%.
Oh my gosh, it's gotten worse.
Yes. I think the bigger point for journalists is go to the source data. We have these data points that are often very compelling, but if you really look under the hood, they may not be well supported. I think one of them that has really gained a lot of traction this year is the idea that 3 million children didn't have any formal education last school year. This is a claim that has gotten a lot of attention. And that data point is not well supported. Now, the issue of kids who have sort of fallen off the radar, I think, is a totally legitimate issue and an important one that reporters really need to dig into. But this data point was a sort of a guesstimate, I would say. And it was produced early last school year with very poor data. And they just sort of took a stab in the dark and came up with a range of 1 to 3 million. And there's just not good data out there to support it. And we need to support that figure, but we need better data to figure out how many kids didn't get a formal education last year and how many still aren't. But the 3 million figure is not that.
Matt, you were a middle school teacher in Colorado. Do you think at all this year about what you would be doing if you had stayed in education, whether you would stay or whether you would go?
It's a good question. I think it really would have turned on numerous different factors, just like for other teachers, it turns on numerous different factors, like how the prior year was, how my compensation was, what sort of support I got from administrators and colleagues. And so I think all of those would have been variables I would have considered, just like those are variables that teachers always consider when they decide to stay or go.
It's almost like teachers are individuals and it's hard to lump them up into one big group, isn't it?
Yes. A good lesson for all big groups.
Matt Barnum is Chalkbeat's national reporter covering education policy and research. Matt, always a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thanks. It was a real treat, Emily.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line. We're at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.